Live from the Washington, D.C. area, it's the Inside Scoop. All the news that our viewers want to know. Now, here's the host.
Good evening. Welcome to the Inside Scoop. I'm your host, Lindsey Davis Stover, and I'm so excited to have joining with me this evening two good friends, Jennifer Woofter, who is a Democratic candidate in 2019 for House District 22, and Christian Worth, who's a Democratic candidate in 2019 for House District 24. Both are in rural parts of Virginia, and tonight we're going to be talking about the importance of raising rural voices, not just in Virginia, but across the country. Christian, Jennifer, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thanks, Lindsey.
Thank you.
Thank you for opening up your homes to us as well. I know we typically would be in the studio, but we appreciate you opening up your homes with us this evening. I'd love to jump right into it and talk about, first and foremost, for our viewers that may have not been familiar with your races last year, just give us an overview of why you decided to run in 2019 in a particularly red area. Jennifer, would you mind telling us a little bit about your experience last year running for office?
Absolutely. So when I ran last year, it was the first time in 6 years and only the second time in 19 years that a Democrat had been on the ballot for this seat. And regardless of what your politics are, I think most Americans agree that democracy works best when there's at least two names on the ballot. And so for me, even though I looked at the statistics, I looked at the demographics, and I knew it was going to be an uphill run, a huge part of my motivation was giving voters a choice at the ballot box. Now, politics included, my opponent and I had quite different views around what good governance meant, what being engaged in the community meant, and what the right direction for Virginia looked like. So there was lots on the table, and really an incredible opportunity in rural Virginia to give voters some options.
Absolutely. Christian, can you tell a little bit about your experience and why you decided to run last year?
Sure. Well, like Jennifer, I live in a very rural, very red district. It's also huge. It's almost 2,000 square miles. So I decided to run because after being involved as a volunteer in some other campaigns, what I realized was that the people that we had elected to represent us in Richmond had at the House level really not done anything to meet the needs, to help expand internet, to address the issues with healthcare. And my professional background is as a lawyer and actually a family lawyer. And quite frankly, I felt like my skills and my experience would serve me well in Richmond, working with both sides of the aisle and with trying to make those connections and build those relationships. So instead of being divided, we could actually get something done for the people of the Commonwealth.
Absolutely. I mean, that's such a good point. And both of you made it, right? Is how important your community and where you live is important to you and why you decided to run. I mean, it was a huge part of why you decided to throw your hat in the race. Can you talk a little bit about some of the issues that maybe were important last year, but I would guess are still equally as important this year, right? And as we move into another election cycle, Christian, can you talk a little bit about what those, dinner table issues are right now?
Sure. And they haven't changed, but they have different relevance in light of coronavirus. So I ran on three main issues: healthcare, internet, and funding education. And look at where we are right now. In our rural communities, children aren't able necessarily to go online and take classes virtually. Our high school had to set up hotspots so that families who could drive their kids in to even finish the coursework from last year. Healthcare, in order to get tested, in order to get treatment, we are served by a very small hospital. One of the facts that I recited a lot in the campaign is that there is no facility at which you can give birth to your child within our district's borders. And remember, I said that's almost 2,000 square miles. So just think what happens when the numbers of coronavirus cases increase at the level it seems like where they're headed right now. we're going to have a crisis, even more of a crisis in rural communities.
Absolutely. Jennifer, did you see those same issues resonating where you ran, or were there any others that people were really concerned about?
Yeah, I mean, I will echo everything that Christian said. Funding for education, healthcare concerns, broadband internet is just, broadband, I will tell you, as a policy issue, is about as unsexy as it comes. It is technical, it is boring, it's hard to get fired up. But what we see with broadband is, without good broadband, man, it is tough to get good quality healthcare. If you don't have access to telemedicine, if you don't have broadband, it's tough to get your kids caught up with after school homework. If you don't have broadband, it is difficult to search for a job. And especially at a time when we are cutting services, libraries are limiting their hours or closed altogether because of coronavirus. It makes everything 10 times more difficult. Other things that I think are really important to keep on the table are things like redistricting and an end to gerrymandering. One of the reasons it is so difficult to get a Democrat elected out here is because in our part of Virginia, the lines were drawn to benefit the Republicans who were in power 10 years ago, the last time the lines were drawn. Now the Democrats are in control, and while they had been hard charging on ending gerrymandering, now they're having second thoughts. And I think it is really important that we elect people on both sides of the aisle who understand the value and hold as almost sacred the right to nonpartisan line drawing, because voters should elect their politicians. Politicians shouldn't choose who their voters are.
That is such an important issue. And I want to talk about redistricting, but I also want to talk about broadband, because access, and you said it beautifully, it's not a sexy issue, right? And I think in many parts of Northern Virginia in particular, it's hard for people to really understand what it means, right? And what people actually need. But my guess is, as you mentioned, broadband touches the quality of healthcare a community can have. Right now, during the COVID pandemic, it really covers the quality of education that our children can have. And I would assume, it's hard to attract businesses and help small businesses thrive as well when that continues to be a need in our rural communities. Can you talk a little bit more about that broadband issue, Christian, and help really people understand and get their head around what that actually means?
Well, what we've learned in the last few months is it means that it's the difference between being able to keep your job or have to give up your job in some cases if you are able to work from home. But really where it affects people is right now you can't go and visit your family. You can't go to another state easily. We all have to be aware of this disease that's among us. And this is how we're connecting, is through, for example, this interview right now. We're doing this through having internet. And I know just personally, we just switched internet providers because my husband was home working, I was home working, my son was on classes, and we kept getting kicked off and kicked off and kicked off. So it was really a problem. And we were lucky that there was an alternate where we live that's worked out much better. But for some people, there's no alternative at all. And what it comes down to is it's not that it's not being expanded. It is being rolled out, but it is being rolled out slowly. It is not being rolled out in the way that it should be for something that should be considered at this point in 2020 a utility. Something you have to have, just like water and electricity. There's no excuse. And the funding that was proposed, it's cut. Every year it gets cut. Whereas if we just had made this one-time investment, our rural communities would be a lot better off right now in this pandemic.
And if I could jump in here too, I think part of the frustration is that we saw this coming 2 decades ago. I built my first website as a freshman in college 25 years ago on my university's high-speed internet network. That website is out drinking beers and having babies. Like, it is that old. And we see wide swaths of our districts with only one provider option or no provider option for high-speed internet. This is an issue that even as our elected representatives on both sides, to be fair, talk a good game about broadband, this is a problem decades in the making. And it's hard to swallow when we rah cheer another few $1 million of investment to, roll out more services over the next 5 years, right? We are missing kids who are going to graduate from high school without access to the internet at their homes because of the slow pace of rollout. And that's something that if we were really serious about this, we would make this, one of, if not the top priority for quality of life, for economic development. So much hinges on your availability to robust internet access.
Absolutely. And like both of you have said, the fact that it's 2020 and we're having this discussion in so many ways is beyond frustrating, because you're right. Not only does this affect our children and their future, it affects our economy and how we live day to day. And right now, Christian, as you said so beautifully, right now it's how we connect with our family members and our loved ones that we aren't able to see. And I think that's critically important. And Jennifer, I know you touched a little bit on redistricting, and redistricting is always a hot topic on both sides of the aisle. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of redistricting? And we saw in this last session, right, some Democrats were saying one thing and possibly doing something else. Can you speak a little bit to that piece?
Yeah. So I will say that this is also an evolving thing. It feels like every week there is a new development around how we're going to negotiate through this. In Virginia, redistricting, we want it to go through a constitutional amendment, which means we need to approve the language in 2 consecutive legislative sessions, and then it goes to the voters as a referendum at the polls. So we're at that stage right now where we have an amendment that is that is passed through the legislature twice, and now it will be on the ballot in November. The question is, are people going to vote for it? And historically, over the last decade or more, it has been the Democrats who have been in the minority saying, oh, you Republicans, you gerrymandered us out. And that's certainly the case in my district. I live in the city of Lynchburg, which was split into 4 different seats, 2 House of Delegates and 2 state Senate seats, largely carving out our African-American communities into a very, very white, very conservative rest of the population. It really dilutes their voice and their political power. We sort of said, oh, this was bad and this was a bad idea and we should fight for a redistricting reform. And now that we won the majority, though, in November in the governor's seats as well as both seats in the state legislature, we do have some people now saying, maybe this amendment isn't good enough. Maybe there are some flaws with it. We should not rush to judgment. We should reject it this time and fix it for a better time in the next round. And I think the problem with that is that that's a trust breaker, is that we campaigned on redistricting reform. Many of the electeds fought for redistricting reform, liked the amendment when they weren't in power, and this idea of suddenly when we are in power and can redraw the lines next year, maybe we want more control. I think that is a trust destroying process. And it makes it incredibly difficult for candidates like Christian and me and other rural candidates out here to build that trust in a highly divided and polarized community, to go out to our constituents maybe who don't really believe that we have the best interest at heart, that maybe harbor suspicions about what a Democrat looks like, and to be able to point to the leadership and say, look, as soon as you got in power, you reneged. For me, that is why I am still, while I agree there are flaws with it, it could be better. I really believe that we make laws and we make progress incrementally. And I would rather take the step forward towards a better nonpartisan or bipartisan step than sort of scrap it now at this late date.
Absolutely. And I know the three of us have had many, many conversations, right, about Democratic politics in rural areas. And there are some that believe that the party should invest only in places with vote-rich populations. I know the three of us have talked about the importance of making sure every single community is in play. I want to ask you both kind of a personal question. I mean, was there a moment on the campaign trail when you knew it was hard, right? I mean, you knew what the past elections had looked like. And was there a moment for each one of you when you realized, you know what, this was all worth it because I was able to do something, or our team was able to do something that really made a difference in this community? Do y'all have one of those types of stories? Because I think as we're thinking about ensuring that people invest in rural areas, these stories are important. And Jennifer, I'd love to hear from you. Do you have a story that maybe you were inspired by someone that made you realize this is worth it? This movement is worth it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that throughout the campaign, it's such a hard slog, right? You're away from your family, you're trying to do your day job and run your campaign. It's such an uphill struggle just anyway. That it was those little glimmers of hope that kept you going and re-energized you and really brought you back to the sense of purpose. Why are you doing this? And I think one of the ones that really stuck out to me is, I mean, in campaigning, you do a lot of door knocking. Not in today's COVID world, but last year you did a lot of door knocking, and there was one woman's door that I knocked on who, in my notes I had that she was a strong Democrat and had a regular voter and in presidentials elections. But when she came out and talked to me, she was like, "Yeah, I don't vote in local elections." And I said, "Well, why not?" And she said, "Well, nobody really represents us. Like, I've never heard from our elected officials. I don't even know who they are. I don't think there's been no outreach to me, and I don't like the way things are going." And I said, I'm so sorry to hear that. And that's having responsive leadership is one of the reasons that I'm running. One of the reasons that frustrates me, politics aside, is just that I never ever got a response when I would email or call with ideas or suggestions or concerns and so she gave me her email and she said, "You follow up with me." And I sent her a little email that night and she replied back and we had a little back and forth and I sort of went on with the campaign. I didn't really think about it because there's always more doors to knock. And on election day, I happened to be at the polls when she showed up. And she gave me a big hug and she said, "I have not voted in a local election in more than 20 years, but I'm here because you showed up at my door and you didn't just show up the once, but you contacted me afterwards and really showed me that you had heard my story. And I think that's the type of person that we need to elect." Now, sadly, I wasn't elected, but I think it was those moments. We need communities to see that their elected officials are reaching out, and we need elected officials who think that that is important. And I think it was those moments that really brought home to me that it was making a difference, even without the win at the end of the day, knowing that there are people out there fighting and seeing community members who are changing their thinking around getting involved in local politics, even just as a voter, I think was incredibly impactful.
That's great. Christian, did you have a moment when you realized your campaign really was making a difference in changing your community?
I don't know that I had one moment. I was thinking about this earlier. I think one thing that I did was that when our volunteers went and knocked doors or made phone calls, if someone said they weren't decided about the candidate yet, that person would go on my list. So I would follow up and knock their door, or I would make a phone call. And so many people would just be so shocked that a candidate was on the phone. And I'd get a lot of, wait, what? It's you? And I'd say, yes, I understand you're undecided, and I'd love to hear what questions you have for me or what you'd like to talk about. And, you know, those were transformative conversations because they often gave me insight into what voters were thinking or what misinformation was out there. I think the other thing that I'll talk about that wasn't necessarily a campaign moment for my campaign, but Jennifer and I are here together because we came together as rural candidates running together. We formed our own independent coordinated campaign, quite frankly, out of sheer necessity. So we were part of a group called Rural Ground Game, and there were 10 of us, 8 House candidates and 2 Senate candidates. And what happened was we realized early on that we were not going to be able to afford to be part of the coordinated campaign that was statewide. Our races were not going to be targeted or supported in the same way as some of the more, let's just say, deemed winnable races. And so the thing is that we all wanted to run, though, the best, most professional campaigns that we possibly could. I think all of us in Rural Ground Game had prior experience as campaign volunteers. A lot of our staff had worked many years in other campaigns. And so we knew what it would take, and we knew that we needed to have someone who could help us interpret data and get to the voters that we needed to talk to and be efficient. When it takes you sometimes 10 minutes to get up and down one driveway, you have to be very, very deliberate about where you're sending your volunteers. And so we came together. We, as a result of having this coordinated effort where we received help with planning our campaigns, we also received help with getting word out in the media. And one thing I'm really proud of that I think put a spotlight on all of our races was we were featured in the Washington Post. And I'm embarrassed to say it's a picture of me in Amherst County at a festival. And at that festival, I had a personal first. I jousted, which many people probably don't realize is actually still a sport. I was offered to get on a horse, and you hold, it looks like a spear or something out of medieval times, right? And you run at a target that's like a little hoop, maybe that big. If they get smaller, the better you are. So that was an adventure. But it was just being invited to even do that and be part of that community. Amherst County is separated by mountains from where I live in Lexington and Rockbridge, but everyone was just so welcoming. So that was sort of a highlight personal moment, was being invited to take part in that.
That's incredible. And Christian, you touched a little bit on many of the challenges, right, that you have running in rural districts. And, you know, the majority of our viewing population is from Northern Virginia. While our show can be accessed all over Virginia, the majority of our viewing population is Northern Virginia. So can you speak a little bit more, Christian, about what some of those challenges are? And Jennifer, I'd love for you to follow up on that as well, because I know, hearing many of the stories that I've heard from the two of you, there are a lot of challenges for candidates running in rural areas. And I'd love for Christian, you to touch on those.
Sure. I mean, the first one is simply geographical. So my district, I live in Lexington, Virginia, which is in Rockbridge County, but the district goes all the way to the border with West Virginia. I have all of Bath County and some of Augusta, because it's been gerrymandered, it's all been broken up. And then I go over another mountain to get to Amherst County, where I don't have all of it, but it's sort of chopped in bits and pieces, but just to get from one end to the other takes several hours. And so our communities are also spread out. We deal with a lot of signs that are posted or no trespassing. And I remember one campaign email, I was out with someone running for Board of Supervisors who actually won, a Democrat. And we just started the camera after we finished knocking on a door for rural driveway. And I just put the camera up on the dash and just let it go until we had reached the main road. And it was minutes and minutes and minutes. And I sent that out as a campaign fundraising email to say, this is what we're doing in order to reach every door that we possibly can. So the second part of that challenge is that we're often having to reach those doors with fewer volunteers than would be possible in a more urban area. So we're doing more with less. And I think if there's any number that really shows how hard we work and what we're able to achieve, I know that for the House-funded races that were supported by the caucus, that the average cost per vote in the 33 races that were supported out of 92 Democrats running was $44.10 per vote. The cost per vote for the 8 of us who ran for the House of Delegates, who are part of Rural Ground Game, that cost per vote was $8.37.
Wow.
So,
I heard you say that figure before, and it is mind-blowing, honestly. I mean, the fact that the races that the caucus supported, each vote was over $44, right? Mm-hmm. And what the two of you did and other rural candidates did for $8 a vote. I mean, that's really remarkable. And that's what I love about so much of the grit in rural areas is you just get it done because you don't have a choice. And I love that. And Jennifer, I know we just have about a minute in this segment left, and we'll continue to have this conversation when we come back. But can you briefly touch on some additional challenges that you saw?
Yeah, I mean, I think we should talk about it more when we come back, but certainly one of the biggest obstacles is that in many cases, you are the only Democrat on the ticket. When people go to vote, there's 8 Republican choices for multiple seats, and your little lone voice, your name kind of there, is that when we don't build the bench, when we don't run people for every seat, every cycle, it's hard to build that momentum. It's hard to get people enthusiastic about a Democratic ticket. And I think that's long-term something we absolutely need to be looking at.
Absolutely. And we're going to continue this important conversation when we come back, because we have so many challenges still to touch on. But I also want to make sure we talk more about why it's important to support rural Democrats, even if you don't live in rural areas. So please stay with us. We'll be right back.
It's all of our responsibility to slow the spread of the coronavirus. So follow guidance from authorities where you live and stay home unless absolutely necessary. You can still use your outdoor spaces like yards and decks. It's also okay to go for a walk or exercise outside. Wear a cloth face covering, stay at least 6 feet away from other people, try not to touch any surfaces, and wash your hands for at least 20 seconds as often as possible. Visit coronavirus.gov for the latest information.
Guess what? I have some news for you. There's free food right there, junk food. You see that truck? Oh, jeez. It's a 2 Michelin star chef. All for free, ladies and gentlemen. All for free.
Here we have a panzanella with summer vegetables and pesto. Enjoy. How we doing?
Fantastic. So what do you got going on underneath that plate there?
This food is really about to be thrown away.
Yeah.
Bro? Is there something wrong with this food? Where did you get it from?
From farmers markets. They put aside the ugly vegetables and the ugly fruits.
Carrot top, soft avocados. It was all food that was going to be discarded.
Even the drink you had is made from like a little bruised peach. Did it taste a little bruised?
Great. It's good.
The average person throws away 24 pounds of food a month.
That's a lot.
Isn't that a lot? Go visit savethefood.com for more information. Thank you. Junk food time!
We're back to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
Welcome back to the Inside Scoop. I'm your host, Lindsey Davis Stover, and we're continuing our conversation with Jennifer Woofter and Christian Worth. Both were candidates for the House of Delegates in 2019. Jennifer Woofter ran in House District 22, and Christian Worth ran in House District 24. And Jennifer, as we were finishing our last segment, we were continuing the conversation about the challenges for a Democrat running in rural areas. Can you talk a little bit more about those challenges?
Yeah. So in the previous section, we talked about how hard it is to run when only a few Democrats are running. In my case, on several of the ballots in the different counties that I was running, I was the only Democrat on the ticket. In some cases, there were 3 Republicans running for sheriff. So if you knew one of those guys in your county, you were coming out and you were voting for him. And then while you were there, you were probably voting for the other Republicans going for other seats. But for me in the House, I was the only Democrat on that entire ballot, which I think makes it tough to drive turnout. But I think a really other important component to this is the money. While of course money should not drive politics, the fact is that it does take money to get out there and reach voters. Whether you are covering the costs of printed materials to leave at someone's door, or paying for the database that kind of tells you which doors you should be knocking on. It does take money to run, and Christian mentioned it. But of the 92 Democrats that ran for the House of Delegates in 2019, only 33% received direct financial support from the House caucus. That means only about 1/3 of candidates got any sort of cash donation from our caucus, leaving 2/3 of us kind of scrambling to raise money, in some cases from communities who don't have a history of donating to Democratic candidates because there haven't been any in the past, or in places where there's just lower cost of living, where there's just not as much money to go around, period. When we talk about needing to get out there, we were forced to get very inventive and very creative and do more with less to get out there. But as we talk about one of the difficulties of running in a rural area, the money has to be part of the conversation.
Absolutely, it does. And like the both of you have now mentioned, I mean, the fact that the caucus only supported 33% of the candidates running, right? And Christian, you mentioned earlier that you were able to pay just about $8 per vote versus some of the districts that, $44+ were spent per vote. And Christian, I heard you say on average $44, which means there are some districts that a lot more than $44 were spent per vote. And I think that's what's really key, is making sure people understand that an investment in our rural communities not only continues to build the Democratic brand, but it also is an investment directly in those communities, because ultimately you will continue to help people that you're running to serve. And I want to touch briefly on the Democratic brand. Can you talk a little bit, Christian, about what that is in the rural communities, and ultimately, how can we make it better?
I think the thing that we have to remember, if you say, what is the Democratic brand in the rural community, is that it's not just limited to what I would say or have in my platform or in my literature or the answers I might give at some type of candidate forum. The fact of the matter is that voters look at Democrats throughout the entire Commonwealth and even in the nation. And so if rural Democrats aren't included in conversations about strategy, about campaigns statewide, then messages get put out there that really hurt us in our communities and where we're running, even though they may be more appealing in other parts of the Commonwealth. And it goes to the trust issue that Jennifer raised earlier. So I will say that sometimes, actually quite a few times, what I would hear is, I really, really like you. You're a good Democrat, but I'm really worried about those Democrats in Northern Virginia and what they're going to do. And so it wasn't even that I wasn't focused on the right issues or seeing them through the lens that our community could see meant that I was in tune with what we needed done. But I was oftentimes fighting the messaging coming out of Richmond, out of Northern Virginia, from other Democratic candidates, because in this connected world, even with not, without universal broadband, people hear and they read news stories about comments that were made. I think of one in particular about it's going to be a whole new Virginia. I'll just paraphrase it and not say who said it, but that scared people in our community a lot.
Yeah. And Christian, let's just be blunt, right? It's abortions and guns, right? Is that we would say, we respect the Second Amendment. We're not out to take your guns. And they would, people would look at us and be like, oh, honey, you're either too dumb to know what's really going on, or you're part of the deception. And I think they would point to things like some of the gun bills that were proposed by our Democratic people that did include gun confiscation elements, and would say, see, we can point to legislation that you are out to take our guns. And we would say, no, but that's not what I stand for. And I think this goes to the point of a 10-minute conversation with any rural gun owner would have pointed out the flaws in that legislation. It's not a matter of we need to be electing all, it's not that we need to win every election, but it's that our side needs to be open and have mechanisms to hear the voices of rural voters. These were some really sloppy bills that the justification was they'll be fixed in committee. And I think the reality is the horse is out of the barn at that point. By the time bad legislation gets introduced, sloppy legislation that could have been easily resolved by hearing and listening to rural voices ahead of time, you've set us back another 5 years. You've made it that much harder for us to connect and build trust with our voters. The same thing on abortion, right? The misstatements, the mishandling. I even had a Democrat come up to me at a table and say, I have voted Democrat my entire life, but I heard with my own 2 ears Governor Northam say he is in support of post-birth abortion. And the idea of, it is hard enough to run your own campaign uphill in a rural red district without having to also take on the baggage of poor decision-making or the missteps of the party. And I think in so many cases, having the people who are already elected, which is often in Northern Virginia or sort of in the urban crescent of Virginia, actively build those bridges with rural Democrats. I think just a little, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. We could have avoided a lot of those problems if rural voices were at the table to begin with.
That's such an important point to make, because I think on two of those issues in particular that you're talking about, to me, it was just a message misstep, right? Just flat out messaging gone wrong on so many levels. And so I think you're so true. Having those voices, the diverse voices within the Democratic Party, right? And two, within the Commonwealth at the table, just so that our elected leaders not only are hearing the concerns, but can actively take steps to ensure that, the messy, right, part of messaging that none of us had to go through wouldn't have taken place. And I think that's really an important point you make.
I would even say to listeners who are hearing this now and saying, well, what was wrong with the gun bills? We're 8 months past that, right? We're months past this. If you still don't know what was wrong with the gun bills, that is a good red flag to you that you do not have rural voices in your sphere of influence right now. We have been out there trying to write op-eds, reaching out to our committees, trying to get a hold of our elected officials, trying to spread the word of raising the red flag. We support common sense gun safety, but there is a problem with some of this legislation. And if you find yourself in that position of well, what was wrong with it? That is a great sign to you that you have some work to do. as we all do, right? Part of this is, how do we get to be better ambassadors? How do we work better for the entire Commonwealth? How do we look ahead and say, how can we make sure that rural voices are raised? This is a great example of where the rubber meets the road.
I think that's so important, just having those important, hard conversations, right? That, maybe different outcomes would have come from that, maybe not. But the importance of conversations can't be underestimated throughout any legislative process on any issue. And I think you both raised an important point on messaging. Let's talk a little bit about national messaging. I mean, we are in a presidential election year. 2020 is a huge year, and we've said it many times, every election, you hear people saying this is the most important election of our lifetime. This one really feels like it. It really feels like the most important election of our lifetime. Can you talk a little bit about how the Democratic national messaging, how it plays in rural communities here in Virginia? Christian, can you talk a little bit on that for us?
I think it just is a bigger stage, but the same issues. So it's not really anything different than what Jennifer and I have already touched on, that when you look at national messaging, make sure that you're not only listening to consultants out of New York or California. Make sure that you have folks from the Midwest, from the South that are involved. There's such a huge need, I think, for Democrats to show, we talk a lot of this good game about we care so much about you. But those are just words, because they're not reflected in the day-to-day reality of people who feel really left behind. They're not prospering. Their manufacturing jobs have disappeared, and they're not being replaced with jobs from Amazon. If you don't have internet, you cannot work remotely for Amazon in Northern Virginia. You just can't. So you just got to scale up, but do it with intention and not just about what makes a good soundbite. And I think the way that you can fine tune that is to actually come and visit us. Pretend there is no coronavirus right now for what I'm about to say, but take a visit. We are so lucky that Delegate David Reed came to our area often, and he said that he had a policy that whenever he was traveling through any part of the Commonwealth, that he'd try to stop and visit with the local Democrats. That mattered. We had, I know for fundraisers just in my district, both Delegate Carol Foy and Senator McClellan came to fundraisers on my behalf and that of other Democratic candidates running. We remember that here. We remember who shows up. And I think that is one thing where Senator Kane's campaign truly excelled. He found a way to show up, to be there when we opened our local offices or come to fundraisers that attracted hundreds and hundreds of people. And that will be remembered. So it's not complicated. You just have to be willing to put in the work.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Jennifer, do you have anything to add on that piece?
Yeah, I mean, I think that my message is just don't make it harder for us. Every time you overtly or implicitly, give the impression that rural people are stupid, that they vote against their own interests, that they are somehow less than, it is not just a slap in the face to the people who voted against us. It is a slap in my face. It is a slap in Christian's face. Nobody's down here voting against their own interest. There is such distrust in government, period. Nobody believes the Republicans are doing a great job versus the Democrats. Is that everyone in government does a terrible job? At least with Republicans, we get lower taxes. This idea that this demonization and this polarization, which I can only see ramping up as we go into this November election, it's killing us. It's killing our communities. It makes it so much harder to have a conversation on a policy issue because there's no foundation of trust. And once that trust is gone, it is so difficult to build back. And so I would say, as much as possible, check yourself, check your friends. Is that, are we treating rural people as less than, as stupid, as uneducated, as too dumb to know how to vote the right way? That is not true. And if we invest in rural Democrats down here, we can move the needle, but it's going to be so much harder if we're fighting against these attitudes.
Right. Absolutely. And Jennifer, I'm so glad you raised that point, because attitudes, we see it time and time again. And as both of you know, I grew up in a small town in Texas, and the majority of my work early on in my career was in Democratic politics in rural communities. And that is an attitude that time and time again, we've had to fight coming from rural areas. And I want to talk a little bit about that. When I was working in rural communities and grew up in one, there was some polarization. But at the end of the day, people were voting for the person, sometimes even over the party. And our country has been polarized in so many different ways now. And I would say more polarized now than ever before. Do you see that same polarization happening in our rural communities, or are there still some of those glimmers of hope where people know that, the candidate is a good person, maybe goes to church with them, maybe sees them in the grocery store, maybe is their Girl Scout troop leader, cub leader? Do you see some of that still existing in rural communities where people know that person and are willing to vote for the person over the party?
I think that you're right, that there is some element to that. Certainly in rural communities, you see each other all the time. There is no errand that you can run where you don't run into someone that you know. So you always want to have your makeup on. there is never a quick trip incognito. But I think that hasn't stopped us from making assumptions about each other. The places where we seem to get along are the places where we seem to leave politics out of it. That we can go to the same church, we can go to the same Girl Scout troop, but we're going to agree not to talk about politics. And I think that does such a disservice, because everything is political. Broadband, while as a technology, who gets broadband and who doesn't, that is a political decision. Healthcare is about healthcare, but who gets healthcare, who pays for it, who profits from it, that is political. And I think that for too long, definitely in rural communities, is that we have allowed the Republicans to claim the moral high ground. They are the ones that respect the military. They are the ones that value life. They are the ones who abide by a strict moral code. And I say that couldn't be further from the truth. I think that Democrats, we are the party that honors life, not just pregnancy and through pregnancy, but everything that makes life worth living and gives us good quality of life and gives people a real shot at the American dream. I would argue that those are in perfect alignment with the Democratic values. And I think that when we just give up that conversation and let the Republicans take those communities and claim those communities as their own, we dig ourselves into a hole that, again, it's real hard to get out of.
Absolutely. I know the two of you have heard me say this before, but a lot of my work is in defense and veterans related policy. And I tell you, nothing makes me more mad is when others claim that work, because time and time again, we've seen with Democratic leadership, important programs being put in place and funded, not just talk, but putting money where their mouth is to better care for veterans and to better care for service members and their families. So I couldn't agree more with you on that. And one of the things I want to also talk about, because I really want to shift into the action piece of this. What can the National Democratic Party, what can the state Democratic Party do to help candidates running in rural areas, help build a robust bench in our rural communities? Christian, what are some of the things that the parties can do to be more helpful?
Well, I think we mentioned the issue of fundraising earlier. And then when you were talking about how do you build that trust in the person, well, that means having a lot of those face-to-face conversations. That means having the resources to be able to keep your candidate hat on and not have to also be helping out with social media and doing treasurer work and helping to write postcards and organize volunteers, because instead of a staff of a dozen, you're working maybe with just a handful of people if you're lucky and you have some great dedicated volunteers. So you can't do the outreach that's needed without the support. And so I think it's got to be a dollars and cents investment. 1 out of 8 Virginians is rural. So we need a proportionate investment in our communities when we're running as Democratic candidates. I think we also need more support for our rural Democratic committees. We need help with training. We need just people to come and volunteer to help so that we can get to all those far-flung doors and make all those phone calls, which is something you can easily do from your living room. In our campaign, I will say that a lot of folks in Northern Virginia in particular really came through. We were really grateful for that support. Postcards for Virginia. I know we ran out of addresses. That's a wonderful thing. Great problem to have. It was really, and it meant so much to our local volunteers. And I'll illustrate why that's so important. When, I guess in 2016, I found myself suddenly being get out the vote phone banking captain. And we had volunteers who were really active and passionate, and a headquarters that was about the size of the room that I'm in right now, which is my home office. And we realized there was no way people could make phone calls. You couldn't have more than a few and they wouldn't be able to hear themselves. So we had just moved into a home, an older home that had some space. We didn't even have enough furniture for it. And so I said, let's just do it at our house. And so in the course of Get Out the Vote, our volunteers in the mountains here in Lexington, Rockbridge County, we made, I want to say 6,000 calls in 5 days. We had shifts, breakfast, lunch, dinner. We had volunteers bring food, and we worked really, really hard. And I can tell you, we were not calling our neighbors. We weren't calling people we knew. We were calling Roanoke. We were calling out into Northern Virginia, but we did it. We did our part. And I'm still very proud of the role I know our community and our local Democrats played in keeping Virginia blue that year. But if you want us to work that hard and to be invested and feel part of the team, feel like we're actually under this big tent party, sometimes it feels like we're left out, then that we need to see investment for our local races. We need to be able to field candidates to help them get trained, to have that training be relevant to the races that we run. I think Jennifer and I both attended some trainings where we would get advice that just, it wasn't going to help us at all. And so part of the really great, the work that's being continued by the Rural Ground Game candidates, we continue to get together virtually and to talk, and we want to help other candidates down the road. I honestly, one of the main reasons I ran for office was not just for this race, but was to learn and to hope that someone else would be willing to jump in and see the work that I had done, or know that the volunteers that we trained to help could help them in their next race, so that it's not just one Democrat on the ticket. Jennifer is absolutely right. The sheriff's races, the local races drove the turnout for Republicans, quite frankly, far more sometimes than our House race, because the sheriff of your community is someone that you know, and you know they have an effect and they have power and impact in your life. It's a little bit harder to picture what a delegate does for you in Richmond, especially when we live in communities where nothing's really happened for our communities. So it doesn't really matter who you elect, because the decision-making seat being in Richmond, we're going to be left behind no matter what. So I'm not trying to sound like I'm lecturing all the really good volunteers that I know that are out there right now listening, the folks who help put on fundraisers for our campaigns. But if it didn't occur to you to support a rural campaign or a rural candidate, then I would urge you next year to look up some of us, look up some of our races, see what we're up against, and make that investment, because that is an investment. It's a long game. We're the short game, right? Our races, we were not successful, but what we did is we planted seeds and we drew support and we talked to folks and we were able to get some publicity for these races. That's because we're thinking for the long game, because we're all on the same team. We're all Democrats and very proud of that. But it also means that we have to feel like we can call out where we see weaknesses and a need for improvement, because again, at the end of the day, it's going to make us all stronger and it's going to make our Commonwealth stronger. And that's really why you run for office. You want to serve, you want to build something. We have children. Jennifer and I have children. You know, we want them to want to live in our community and come and visit and not feel like they have to leave and go somewhere else to get jobs. But we're far from that right now. So I would invite anyone to reach out to Jennifer or myself, and we'd be happy to put you up. Come and visit. We live in a beautiful, beautiful part of this Commonwealth.
That's fantastic. And the biggest important point that you just made is we're all in this together. No matter where you live in Virginia, we are all in this together. And Jennifer, I know we just have a few minutes, but can you give our viewers some ideas of how they can really get involved and support rural candidates?
Yeah, let me be really specific. 1 in 8 Virginians is rural. If you are making political donations, put 1 in 8 of your dollars into a rural campaign. Donate directly to those campaigns, recognizing that a lot of times donating to the caucus or other groups doesn't filter down equally to all of the races. And in many cases, that money is going to places where Democrats win by 20 plus points. Put it where it's going to make the most difference. The second is talk to your current Democratic elected officials and make sure, ask them, push them. How are you raising rural voices? What are you connecting with? How are you getting insight into what's happening in rural parts of Virginia? It is so important for the long game.
Well, thank you both so much for being with us tonight. Thank you for doing what you're doing and making sure that we can be competitive as Democrats in every part of the Commonwealth. So thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Christian, for being with us. Thank you all for joining us this evening. Good night.